remarks, I would like to recognize the presence today with us of Mordechai Ben Porat. Mordechai, of course, played a central role in the freedom, in the liberation of Iraqi Jews. He is a founder of the World Organization of Jews from Arab Countries. In the 1960s, he was a lone soldier at the United Nations, speaking about this issue before anyone really wanted to hear about it. So Mordechai, we are honored to have you here with us today. My remarks will focus on fundamental questions and answers, myths and facts about the Middle East. We're hearing a lot of chatter these days in the Arab media about the fact that there were no Jewish refugees. Once again, Jewish history is being distorted and subverted by revisionism. To make their case, the Arab world uses the mantra of what I call the four no's. No, there were no large populations of Jewish refugees in Arab countries. No, there was no discrimination against Jews born and living in Arab countries. No, Jews were not pushed out and expelled from the countries of their birth. They left of their own free will. And no, Jews did not leave extensive assets behind. Therefore, they're not deserving of compensation. This is classical disinformation. Let me deal with each one of these seriatim. Disinformation number one. No, there were no large populations of Jewish refugees in Arab countries. You have in your kit a chart which documents the fact that there were 856,000 Jews in Arab countries in 1948. By contrast, how many Palestinian refugees were there? In September of 1949, the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine estimated that there were only 726,000 Palestinian refugees displaced as a result of Israel's War of Independence. Therefore, more Jews displaced from Arab countries than Palestinians displaced as a result of Milchemet HaShichrur. Disinformation number two. No, there was never any discrimination against Jews living in Arab countries. This chart reveals a pattern of systematic state-sanctioned legislation depriving Jews of their civil and political rights, stripping of citizenship, arrests and detentions, riots and pogroms. Yes, indeed, there were periods in some countries when Arabs were permitted religious, educational, professional, and business opportunities. But the reality is that Jews were an oppressed and persecuted people, and this persecution was well known. In fact, warning about the danger to Jews appeared in a front-page article in the New York Times in May 16th of 1948. Disinformation number three. No, Jews were not pushed out or expelled from Arab countries. They left of their own free will. As mentioned by Deputy Minister Danny Ayalon, our research uncovered that in 1947, the Political Committee of the Arab League, which included Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, and Yemen, engaged in a criminal conspiracy to use their Jewish citizens as political weapons in their struggle against the founding of the State of Israel. This 7-point Arab plan, which is fully documented here in a dossier with original documents which we uncovered in the archives of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This document says that bank accounts of Jews will be used, and the money used to be given to the Palestinians, the armies in Israel fighting against the establishment of the State of Israel. This draft declaration said that anyone who doesn't accept to include their sons in the Arab army can be arrested. They took Jewish boys and sent them to Palestine to fight against Jews who were trying to secure the State of Israel. From this stemmed state-sanctioned discriminatory measures. Many countries adopted laws depriving Jews of their citizenship. Edicts of expulsion were enacted in Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Lebanon. Here are samplings of these formal edicts. In Iraq, Law number 1 of 1950 was used to deprive Jews of Iraqi nationality. In Egypt, the first nationality code mentioned that a person born in Egypt was entitled to Egyptian nationality only if their father belonged to, quote, racially to the majority of the population of the country whose language is Arabic and whose religion is Islam. This provision later served in the 50s as the official pretext for expelling all the Jews from Egypt. In Libya, the Council of Ministers enacted a royal decree that forfeited nationality to anyone who was accused of, quote, Zionism. And what was Zionism? Morally or materially in favor of Israel's interests. A definition so vague that allowed Libyan authorities to virtually expel Libyan Jews at will. And finally, last disinformation number 4. No, Jews did not leave extensive assets behind. They're not deserving of compensation. With respect to lost assets, a study was conducted in 2008 by Sidney Zabludov, an economist who worked for the White House, for the CIA, and for the Treasury Department for 30 years. He concluded that $6 billion of losses were suffered by Jews, lost assets by Jews in Arab countries, whereas only 3.9 billion losses were incurred by Palestinian refugees. But pay particular attention. That does not include communal property, synagogues, schools, cemeteries. Palestinians had no communal assets. Therefore, the wealth lost by Jews from Arab countries is significantly, extensively more significant than the losses suffered by Palestinian refugees. But yet, notwithstanding the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Jews displaced from Arab countries who suffered significant losses, the world still does not recognize the fact that there were Jewish refugees. And when we went to the State Department of the United States, they said to us, Jews weren't refugees, they came right to Israel. What makes you think they were refugees? So, the fundamental question, were Jews fleeing from Arab countries really refugees? The answer is yes. Our research uncovered at the High Commissioner for Refugees that on 2 occasions, in 1957 with respect to Jews fleeing from Egypt, and in 1972 with respect to Jews fleeing from North Africa, on both those occasions, Jews were determined to be bona fide refugees under international law, subject to the full protection of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Jews were determined to be legally refugees. Question: even if Jews were fleeing Arab countries, were determined to be refugees, do they have any rights today, over half a century later, when they're no longer refugees? There is no statute of limitations on the rights of refugees. If anyone possessed bank accounts, if anyone possessed pensions, you do not lose those assets, notwithstanding how many years have passed. So there were 2 populations of refugees, roughly the same numbers, roughly during the same time period, both legally declared to be refugees under international law. Question: how did the international community, through the United Nations, react to these 2 populations of refugees that emerged out of the Israeli-Arab conflict? Fact: our research revealed startling differences in the conduct of the international community vis-a-vis these 2 populations of refugees. We analyzed United Nations resolutions, we analyzed the number of agencies that were mandated to deal with Palestinian refugees, and we analyzed the financial resources that were allocated to these 2 populations. With respect to resolutions, the United Nations has adopted 1,088 resolutions on every single aspect of the Middle East. 172 of these resolutions deal specifically, uniquely, and only with Palestinian refugees. Notwithstanding the fact that we say that 242, whose language says just solution of the refugee problem, refers to Jewish refugees, as it indeed does, as it is indeed underscored by Judge Arthur Goldberg, one of the drafters of 242, there are no UN resolutions that specifically mention the words Jewish refugees. Not one. 10 agencies were mandated by the United Nations to deal with Palestinian refugees, to maintain them in camps for all these years, in a sense to be used as a political weapon against the state of Israel. Only one agency dealt with Jewish refugees, and that was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. But they did not do any protection. They did not protect the Jews fleeing. They did not do any resettlement. They only dealt with recovery of assets. And might I say, they were not very successful at that as well. Funding. From 1950 to 2007, UNRWA, through the UN, has contributed $13.7 billion to maintain Palestinian refugees as refugees. By contrast, how much money was spent by the international community for Jewish refugees? We uncovered one fact, $35,000. It was a personal decision by the High Commissioner for Refugees to give $35,000 out of his personal account to help Jews fleeing from Egypt in 1957 on two conditions. One, that nobody would say anything about it. Keep it secret. Don't let anybody in the world know that he was helping Jews. And number two, he converted it into a loan. And the Joint Distribution Committee had to pay back the $35,000 that the High Commissioner advanced. That is the extent of the international community's differential and disproportionate treatment of the two populations of refugees. So in closing, let me ask this fundamental question. Why is it important now to talk about Jewish refugees, over 60 years after the fact? The answer is fundamental. The narrative of Jewish refugees from Arab countries is central to the legitimacy of the State of Israel. Israel's detractors, Ahmadinejad and others, state that Israel is an illegitimate state made up of white Europeans who were parachuted into the Middle East, which was fundamentally an Arab world, and that is the reason for the conflict of the Middle East. This is a gross and obscene distortion of history. We must underscore at every opportunity that for 2,500 years, Jews in substantial numbers resided in the Middle East and North Africa, fully 1,000 years before the advent of Islam. We, Jews, we are the indigenous people of the Middle East, and we must not allow the rich, vibrant heritage of patrimony of Jews in this region to be expunged from the history books. The first injustice was the mass violations of human rights of Jews in Arab countries. Today, we must not permit a second injustice, and that would be to allow the international community to recognize rights for one refugee population, Palestinians, without equally and justly and fairly recognizing rights for Jewish refugees from Arab countries as a matter of law and equity. That is our mission. That is our responsibility. Thank you very much.